Hello, this time we're going to talk of who our stakeholders are. Strictly seen, almost everybody could be considered as a potential stakeholder. However, not all stakeholders have the same interest in a particular issue or are equally affected. This is why identifying and classifying our stakeholders will help us to understand them better. Identifying stakeholders is an iterative process. New stakeholders can be identified by existing ones. Besides, some stakeholders will be important at the beginning of the project, but not at the end. And conversely, others may not be important at the start, but become more important later. This is why it is important to review stakeholders regularly to avoid missing important ones. A first step to identify stakeholders is to do a brainstorming, preferably with some people of your team, in order to set a list of all people that may be affected or will have an interest in a particular issue of your Natura 2000 site. At this stage, it is important to do as an exhaustive list of potential stakeholders as possible, in order to ensure that we won't forget any hidden stakeholder. In the second step, we will organize them by groups of interest. These are the most common groups of interest in Natura 2000 sites. In first place, we have the public sector, the local administration, regional administration, governmental agencies such as the Water Agency or the Forest Agency, and of course, Natura 2000 site staff. Remember these internal stakeholders. Second place, we have the private sector for profit. We can have the landowners, the farmers, fishers, foresters, and all kind of tourism business. Third place, the civil society, the non-for-profit sector. So we can have the environmental NGOs, universities, research centers, associations, local organizations operating in the area, other groups. And in fourth place, what we call the general public, which are the families, bikers, hikers, kayakers, skiers. And of course, each of you will have different stakeholders in your particular Natura 2000 site, especially if you are managing a marine one. Now that we have a full list organized by groups of interest, we need to identify who among all these stakeholders are the key ones. For that, we need to have an idea of how interested or affected these stakeholders are and what is their level of influence or power. This can be done by drawing an interest versus influence grid, where we will display in one axis the level of interest, either positive or negative, and in the other one, the relative influence or power. How do we do it? In our table of stakeholder groups, we need to score their level of interest and the level of influence or power. This in a scale of 0 to 5, being 0 the low and 5 the high. You can be more detailed and decline one of these sectors in some subsectors or subgroups if needed. For example, it would be useful to decline the private sector in uh, tourism sector, for example, or farmer sectors. You can also add a relative size of the group, also in a scale of 0 to 5. Once you have scored all your stakeholder groups for interest, engagement, and influence or power, then you need to plot them in a grid. So for example, school and high schools, they have an interest very low, have scored about 1, and an influence of power about also low, 1 would appear here. Instead, regional and local administration have an interest of 3, but has a high power, about 5, and would appear here. We need to pay close attention to all the stakeholders that appear in this part of the grid. These are the stakeholders that have the greatest power and the greatest interest. They are what we call the key players. We need to put all our efforts in these groups because they are powerful and they can influence our project in a positive or in a negative direction. So it's important to engage them early and maintain the right level of communication with them. If possible, we can involve them in our decision-making body. We need to show consideration with the stakeholders that appear in this part of the grid. These are stakeholders that are very highly engaged or with a high interest, but have a relatively low influence or power. Nonetheless, if they are upset, they may gain influence. So it is important to keep them informed and even consult them on their area of interest. In fact, they are potential goodwill ambassadors. We need to keep satisfied the stakeholders that appear in this part of the grid. These are people who have a high influence or level of power, but are not particularly interested in our Natura 2000 site or in the project we are trying to implement. Having such an influence or power, it is interesting to try to increase the level of interest. So the aim is to move them to this part of the box. And a way of doing it is to try to engage them and consult them in what we think could be interesting for them. The stakeholders that appear here in this part of the grid are low priority stakeholders. Nevertheless, it's good to monitor them because this status could change and to keep them informed via general communication. One of the aims could be to increase their interest so that they move to that side of the table. To sum up, stakeholders that appear in this part of the grid are our key stakeholders. They have a high influence and a high interest. We need to focus on these stakeholders first. Those that appear here have a low influence but a high interest. We need to show consideration to them. Those that appear in this part of the grid, we need to keep them satisfied. They have a high influence but a low interest. And those that appear in this part have a low influence and a low interest. We need to keep them informed. We may want to identify which stakeholders are likely to support our site, our project, and which ones may try to block it. A quick way to visualize these stakeholders are by using a heat map. Heat map is a graphical representation using colors. So we would paint in green color those stakeholders that support our site or our project. We will put in yellow those who are neutral. And we will paint in red those who oppose. Pay attention here. The two type of stakeholders, both of them key players because they have a high power and they have a high interest. One of them is painted in green because he's a supporter, he has a positive interest, and the other one is painted in red because he has an interest but negative one. So through heat maps, you can quickly see who is supporting us and who is opposing us so that we can take care quickly and early enough this kind of stakeholders. And now that we know how to quickly visualize who is opposing us and who is supporting us, we need to understand what the reasons they have and what we can do about it. In the next video, we will talk about how to understand our stakeholders.